Donald Evans and his legal advisors returned from a conference at Gray's Inn where they'd been discussing tactics for tomorrow's hearing.
We want to tell the story which has been suppressed by court order for all this time. The thalidomide story is as much a legal tragedy as a medical one.
Contempt is about prejudicing the legal issues in a case. If you steer clear of those, but advance the moral arguments, then you should be allowed to do this.
Harry Evans said, "If necessary, I'll run a story about thalidomide for the next 10 years to get justice for these children." Now, I know that sounds like a film script, but that's what he said.
Hello again. So first of all, be ready because I may ask you to sing some of your answers. Behind every great investigation is a great lawyer, ideally a team of lawyers, and that's what we're going to talk about today, battling in the courts, the legal challenges, the legal defense around great journalism. We have a star-studded panel. Mark Stevens, immediately to my left, one of the world's leading media lawyers and a fierce, fierce advocate for free speech around the world. Pia Sarma, editorial legal director of Times Newspapers Limited, which is the publisher of The Times and The Sunday Times, and deputy general counsel at News UK. She advises on journalistic investigations and leads defense litigation. Patrick Radden Keefe, he's one of the masters of investigative journalism. All of you know him. I hope all of you have read many of his books, but including Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty. Because I said at the beginning that although we at Reuters, we dig deep and we do slow news and take time news, we also do fast news. And today in the news this week is that we have the latest installation of the phone hacking trial. So I want to ask the two of you just really quickly for your view on it. Mark, Prince Harry has pretty much said that for the rest of his life, one of his goals is going to be to destroy the UK tabloids. So how's that going to play out?
Well, it's interesting because I think everybody accepts as a fact that hacking occurred. And so we've seen news pay out, but they've never gone to trial, which has been a deliberate plan, and they've executed it brilliantly. And the difficulty with the Mirror Group, who are taking this, or the receiving end of this particular case, is that they are taking things to trial. They've already lost one trial. People will remember perhaps Paul Gascoigne being reduced to tears in the box. So they've established that phone hacking took place there, so they're 15 love down going into this trial. And this morning, quite bizarrely, we lawyers call it confess and avoid. So essentially, the King's Counsel for the Mirror Group got up and said, we should pay you compensation, Harry, because we unlawfully gathered information about you. But we didn't do any of the phone hacking stuff on you. And that's what Judge Fancourt's got to look at. So I would say that they're already 30 love down, and they're probably going to lose it in straight sets.
Pia, you of course work for a News Corp. Can you tell us about News Corp's approach broadly to these cases?
So, I mean, I think there's been so many of these cases, civil claims, and they are quite rightly winding their way through the court system. And everyone who has a legitimate case will have that heard in the courts as they should do. I mean, I think it's really difficult when you've had the massive shake-up in the press that we've seen since the Leveson inquiry that was sparked, obviously, by the hacking. to see what's happened now to the press. And I was telling Alessandra earlier that it just made me think of Sir Harry, because it was because of this that I was dispatched by Anthony Lester QC. There was a glimpse of him going into the High Court in the clip that you just saw. Anthony Lester was James Evans, the Sunday Times lawyer's counsel, and stood by Harry Evans when he took the thalidomide case up to Strasbourg. And when I took on this I felt responsible and slightly overwhelming job now 14 years ago, Anthony Lester called me up and said, you've got to get behind the reforms that are going on. Little did we know that the Leveson inquiry and this great big ruckus in press was just ahead of me. And after the Leveson inquiry, we were dealing with the fallout from the hacking cases and the proposals for reforms in British law to tighten, really, the laws against press freedom. A lot of them were contradictory to press freedom, and some proposals still are. And Anthony Lester and I were talking in quite a lot of detail about how far these should go. And I just had one message, which was, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And he said, well, go and tell Harry Evans that, because he'll be a keen set of ears for that, exactly that. So I went, completely overwhelmed to see him. And of course, he did listen in huge detail to everything that I was saying about what's happening on the ground, because while all this plays out, journalism continues. So you have improper use of different methods that have been called out quite rightly, but investigative journalism still continues. And I think it's got harder, and it's probably got harder as a result, or partly as a result of the changes in the law and the press regulation that we see in this country.
Great, and we're going to get to that. But Patrick, let me ask you, in your reporting on the Sackler dynasty, both for the New Yorker and for the book, you went up against some of the strongest forces of corporate America. And tell us how you navigated that. Tell us the hardest moments.
Well, it's funny. I think I'm sure for many of the journalists in this room, if you write about people who are wealthy and powerful, you encounter these lawyers who get in touch. I think it's part of the toolbox at this point. And I should say, I have never been sued, but I've been on the receiving end of many, many threats, legal threats. And in the case of the Sacklers, I initially wrote a piece about them in the New Yorker, and then it was just announced that I was going to write a book. And I got a 17-page single-space letter from a lawyer, and then a series of additional letters and a litigation hold, which is one of these things that says, it looks like we will probably litigate against you. So all of your papers, all of your notes, all of your documents, everything on your phone, all of that is evidence in the potential future lawsuit. So you need to retain it all, which was an issue. At a certain point, a source got in touch with me and said he wanted to send me 40 boxes of documents. This was a lawyer who had been involved in litigation with Purdue. And my wife kind of looked up and said, and under that litigation hold, how long would we have to hold on to these 40 boxes of documents? I said, potentially forever.
And your wife, of course, your wife is a lawyer.
My wife is a lawyer, so she knows whereof she speaks. Yeah. So I developed this kind of intense epistolary relationship with this lawyer who the Sacklers had hired. And I have to say, listen, I think it is designed to intimidate, to make you timid. It frustrated me, but in some ways it only intensified my desire to keep pushing and to make the book as rock solid and bulletproof as I could. And also, part of the story I was telling was about how a family and their corporation had gotten away with terrible things for a very long time. And I think often when we ask those questions, even in other contexts, Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, pick your figure, right? Where when the music stops, everybody looks and says, my God, how could they have gotten away with it for so long? Often it's the case that behind them and around them are lawyers and facilitators, people who, in my view, should know better. Who help abet these people and keep them in business and help make the press timid and shut down whistleblowers and shut down investigative reporting.
Pia, you deal with this every day.
Yeah, I think this is the core of the problem in some ways. Should they know better? You would think that they're meant to be encouraging justice, trying to find truth. Now, I can sit up here and feel like I've got the high moral ground because that's what I try to do, because I work with great journalists and reporters every day. Looking after whistleblowers and sources is something that really troubles me, because you see how difficult it is for reporters to keep them on side when they know that rich and powerful will come after them, potentially. and they don't want to talk to you. And I hear this time and time again. Reporters will come to you and say, look, I've got this great story. Can you walk me through the legal problems with it? And then the next conversation will be, I'm losing my source. I'm trying to keep them warm. They need this protection. They need that protection. What can we do to look after them? And of course, you can't step too far that way as a journalist. You can't say to them, don't worry, everything's going to be fine, because that isn't always the case. And you could be grappling with any number of issues: privacy, confidentiality, contempt of court, which was the thalidomide issue, Official Secrets Act. We've had the National Security Bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment. And to me, it's a veil for embarrassment on the part of the government. Stories which are embarrassing could fall foul of that, and journalists will be caught up in that.
But of course, one of those things about sources is that increasingly people are not going after the journalist, they're going after the source. They're trying to find out who it is and stop it at source and put the source in jeopardy. And so, one of the things I think is a real issue is that sources are more chary, because we have this wonderful shield law, this wonderful protection for sources, but actually they're using different things to go around it. So, to give you an example, a case I was involved with, a policeman was going to a telephone box to phone his journalistic contact. And the police were following him because they thought he was leaking, but they couldn't do anything. So they subpoenaed the telephone records of the telephone box he was using. And that wasn't quite enough because it didn't identify it. So what they did was they put a camera on the telephone box and then got the exact time he made his call, cross-referenced that with the call records, and found that, yes, lo and behold, a journalist had been there, had lost her bicycle, been stolen a year before, and they were able to cross-reference which journalist she was talking to. So then they went after the source. They weren't interested in the journalist. Do you see that regularly?
I mean, what you're saying, just to divide it, because we've jumped into a couple of topics, is we've come a long way from contempt of court and thalidomide, right? I mean, Pia, you're talking about protecting, not just your reporters, you're talking about protecting your reporter sources more and more. But equally, that's sort of one big challenge now, but equally, there are many new laws that go after journalists, if only it were only for libel, right? But actually that now journalists are under attack.
Well, libel lawyers are dead. I mean, everybody in the room thinks they need a libel lawyer. I pray for libel cases because they're so much easier and so much cheaper than when they go targeting journalists and when they go targeting sources. Particularly when they start to attack and criminalize journalists, where you're getting into much more high-stakes stuff. So give me a libel case every day of the week. At least I've got a chance. And of course, the problem with lawyers is they're not homogenous. So you need someone skilled like Pia, who is more than a libel lawyer. She's able to look at the human rights issues and the other wide-ranging issues that are going to start coming towards you.
The one thing that I've definitely seen is how wonderful it is to have a big organisation. And I admire and respect journalists who don't have that behind them, because it takes a series of decisions to be made before a story can hit online, on the front page, whatever it is, let alone sort of a book that takes such a long time to put together. And making those decisions, how far do we go? Who do we protect? How do we steer it? How do we put this on ice for now? What angle to take? I always say to editors, what's your headline? What's your top line here? Because if you talk to me about that, we can steer towards that. And we don't want to water down stories. We want to get the truth out. And also the other message for reporters and journalists is, you stick to the facts. You've got to get it right, because they will come gunning for you if you don't. And I think that helps with standards. But I just find it amazing with thalidomide. Harry Evans and the team at the Sunday Times were pushing for more compensation for these victims, and that was seen to be an interference with the administration of justice. I would like to think that wouldn't be the case now, but I tell you what, there'll be something else that we'd be fighting with.
Yeah, I do think it's an important, it is one thing that I can sound probably almost cavalier about my dealings with the Sacklers. But of course, I had the backstop of Doubleday, which has been my publisher for years, and a lawyer whom I have a very close relationship with. I had the backstop of The New Yorker, which is tangled with all variety of quarries and really held very strong. And so it actually got to a point with the Sacklers where there were there was a sort of a wedge strategy where the lawyer was writing to the New Yorker and essentially saying, listen, we need to tell you about this guy you've got. There may be some things about him that you don't know. And made a similar appeal to my publisher, actually really clearly trying to kind of separate us, find some daylight between us. And in both cases, I felt very fortunate that I had these lawyers who really stood by me.
It's interesting. It goes back to what Dean was saying in the very first panel, which is like sometimes what happens is that, the leaders or the top corporate players will say, wait, I'm going to go above and beyond I'm going to go straight to the boss, right? And sort of talk like on an equal footing. And of course, most editors-in-chief will sort of, avoid that. Sorry, Mark.
No, I was going to say that, what Patrick is talking about has also become part of the modern playbook. So when you're dealing with very large corporates with essentially bottomless pockets, they'll start following the journalists. They'll start digging into the journalist's private life and start putting out negative stories. So you then have to understand how you might be followed and all the rest of it. So it's getting much dirtier.
Well, this happened to me, I should say, just because it's funny that the strategy you describe, I've always thought of that as the can I see your manager approach to dealing with the press. But I was working on the book during the pandemic, at home writing, and came outside with my wife and 2 small boys, and a neighbor came over. We live in the suburbs outside New York City, and said, there's a guy in an SUV who's been sitting in front of my house watching your house all day. Wow. And I can't tell you that the Sacklers arranged for that. And I have a feeling that if somebody in their indirect employ did, they might not even know about it, because one of the things that I found when I looked into it was that you get all of these kind of structures within structures, right? So you have crisis PR firms and then lawyers and private investigators and so forth. It's very hard to trace the provenance of any of these things. But I will say that Nan Golden, the photographer, was also involved in activism involving the Sacklers at this point, and also followed. So yeah, I think it's part of the playbook.
Because the clock is ticking, so I want to quickly ask sort of where the situation legally is most critical at the moment globally, and then I also would like to sort of spend the last few minutes talking about, okay, so what is positive to come out of this? What is being done that can help actually promote investigation? So you deal with cases all over the world. A very prominent case in Iran. We just heard a lot about the situation. Where do you see the situation most critical the most critical situation around the world in terms of, press freedom, really?
Well, I think the issue is that the playbook is being replicated by totalitarian and less totalitarian regimes increasingly around the world. So you looked at Khadija in Azerbaijan, and they tried to blackmail her into silence. That didn't work, and so
but not for journalism, ostensibly, right? By shaming her, right?
Yeah, so by shaming her, by filming her, secret police filming her with her lover, which of course in a Muslim country is fairly problematic. The bravery for her, she published the stuff and then went on the attack. But this is starting, so what they're now doing, and this is pretty ready, is that they will criminalize people for not their journalism. So they want to delegitimize the person so that the message becomes delegitimized. So take Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong, for example. He's being done for tax. Maria Ressa, she was done for tax, and all sorts of other things. And indeed, if you go back to Ai Weiwei, even, not a journalist, but an expressive person, and they did him for tax too. And it's about trying to get them to pull back. It's also about intimidating and also creating a narrative around them. And of course, it's got much worse now. We're seeing, in Hong Kong with Jimmy Lai, we're seeing the national security law used. So he hasn't yet been prosecuted under the national security law. He's in jail for something else. And yet that hasn't stopped the regime in Hong Kong shutting down the business, essentially seizing all the cameras, all the printing presses, getting rid of it, sacking all the staff, without any due process. So not being convicted. And there are American investors and investors from around the world who are putting money into Hong Kong, and they've just lost it. And I think people need to understand that this kind of asymmetric warfare that people are bringing on to us as journalists needs an asymmetric response. So, if there's an investment into Hong Kong, we need to start putting warnings out through governments about it may be dangerous. Well done, the New York Times, for moving out of Hong Kong, going to Bangkok. People need to start making these very hard decisions. And then, of course, it exacerbates even further where they start targeting and trying to kill people. And that just is sort of ramping it up and sees how important it is. We saw in the previous session about the Iranians. The Iranians have been targeting people in London. One of the cases I'm doing at the moment, my client has been taken into protective custody because there was a real and imminent threat to his life.
And I think you Evan, we haven't mentioned Evan, of course, being treated as espionage, right? Being
well, this is
hostages, right? Journalists turned into hostages.
And this is again part of the Iranian playbook.
But I think you also have to look, Mark, don't you, at the balance of power globally, because the ambition of a country like India seems to be coupled with clamping down on a free press. And I think a country like that will find it very hard to listen to a Western democracy telling them what to do. So where does the international cooperation kick in to achieve these things? But one thing I would say is that, you have standards which are set, and there is copycat behaviour, and this country is not getting any better. And I think there was an effort to try and make this not the libel capital of the world. I think it still is. I think actually libel is still a problem. But I think the stuff that you see doesn't float up to the courts because it's all behind the scenes. It's all before you publish. It's all last minute stuff. It's the kerfuffles which act as a huge deterrent. And then if you add on top of that government action to suppress news and information, I don't think we're in a good place.
You say that, but Patrick, you published. Your book is out. You did it. And what happened after that?
Well, they went very quiet once the book came out. I think to the point that you raised earlier, if you, the truth is a strong defense, right? And so, the book has 100 pages of endnotes precisely to kind of cut off in advance any effort to question its credibility or the validity of the things I was saying. Yeah, I would say we can look pretty close to home here. I think England continues to be a great destination for libel tourists of every stripe, oligarchs and others who have brought cases and threatened cases all the time. The vetting of my books here is usually much different than it is in the States. And back in the States, which takes such pride when it comes to these types of things, I would say one thing to watch is that there is a movement afoot to try and overturn the Supreme Court precedent that established the actual malice standard. There are lawyers who would like to see some case make its way up to the Supreme Court. And with the current Supreme Court, it's anyone's guess how that might work out. So I think that is, it's a protection that I hold dear, but one that I don't take for granted.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I think that's a huge threat, and it just shows how the balance changes over time, because this country looks over there and goes, wow, they've got this constitutional First Amendment, but plus they've got New York Times and Sullivan, the great case, and it's under attack right now in a really serious way.
That's right. Mark, you were jumping in.
Yeah, I do think that, these are important issues, but for me, I'm looking at people like Evan Goresevich and, people who have been taken. And, when you're looking at sending people out, think about what are their familial risks. So the Iranians started this game by putting pressure on people at Deutsche Welle, Farsi, BBC Persian, and Iran International. And of course, they looked for people with dualities and with family in country. And the same is happening with the Russians, and they're looking for those people. So of course, they may have linguistic skills, but really think about the human rights impact assessment, the risk assessment. Some of the security advisors, I don't think are quite up with the way in which these things are now evolving and what the latest edition is. They can give us much broader skills and assessments, but actually the risks that journalists face are becoming quite unique.
And you mentioned, of course, foreign journalists. There are risks on either side. A foreign journalist with a foreign passport who can be used as a hostage, but also journalists operating in their own countries for foreign organizations will be targeted, and it's much harder than they don't have the protection of a foreign passport. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I think we can summarize this very energetic panel by saying that, I think somebody mentioned before that Harry used to work around the lawyers, find a way to work around the lawyers, but what is abundantly clear from this panel and from what is going on now in most newsrooms is that really legal counsel, the lawyers are fundamental partners to what we do every single day. So thank you. Thank you to the journalists. Thank you to the lawyers. And thank you to all of you.